Welcome back to ASD, A New Perspective, the podcast show where we help you understand what is going on in the mind of your child. And we do encourage you that growth for your child is possible. I'm Kat Lee, and in this podcast, Dr. Gutstein continues his conversation with us about adapting and reminds us that it is so important for both parents and professionals to know of the value of adapting for our children. Let's listen in.
So, somewhat of how we determine whether something's dynamic or static is perceptual, is how we see it, how we think about it. I'll give you another example. Example is global warming, or global weirding, as some people say, which is the sort of extreme events in the environment that are going on, which is an interesting concept, global weirding. I like that better than warming because it has to do more with a dynamic, a predictable system than some kind of linear, system. That once we start messing with it, it just becomes more volatile, not necessarily going in one direction, right? So global weirding. Let's talk about that. There's a country called Vanuatu in the South Pacific, and it's an island country, not a very big country, but it's sinking. It's about to go underwater. In other words, if you live in this country, you face the prospect that next week you could wake up and not have a country anymore. It could be gone. So you're going to see global weirding or warming as a very dynamic event. You're going to wake up every day and say, well, should I get my raft? Should I go on a boat? Should I emigrate? Should I do something, right? Right. Now, for most of us, if we're not radical environmentalists or on top of things, I don't call it radical in a bad way, but if we're not primary environmentalists, we think of it as static and complex. And the reason I tell you we think of it as static is we walk away from it. We say we don't have to think about it today. We can think about it when we want to. We can donate money when we want to, walk away, even go to a demonstration, not to. But you don't think of it as dynamic. It's not a dynamic event in your life. You don't perceive it that way. So you don't treat it that way. Whether it is or not is a whole different issue. I don't want to get into what, if the tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, blah, 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 that type of thinking. But the point is, a lot of things in life you're not going to think of. Depends on how you perceive, how you deal with it. Complicated, complex, dynamic, static. Even simple versus complex. If you're an accomplished ballroom dancer and I put you on the floor to dance, it's simple because you don't have to think about it. Your feet just moves, you're just doing it. You can have a wonderful conversation with somebody else and you're doing wonderful moves on the dance floor. Put me on the dance floor, it's complex and dynamic. Complex, not simple dynamic. It's complex because I don't know what the heck, I have to think about every move I make. It probably screws it up, but the point is I'm a novice at it, so it's still complex and dynamic. Whereas if you're an expert, it's simple. Somebody's a new driver versus you've an experienced driver. Is a good example. You found yourself, if you're an experienced driver, having driven someone from one place to another, sometimes without even knowing you've done it. You said, "Oh my God, I just went from here to there." And that's an example of your simple, dynamic, right, brain took over. Right, your higher level, top-down, complex, dynamic brain was on doing something else for a period of time. Right, and the simple took over, which is scary on driving on a road because you really don't want to do that. But it shows you that you can. A novice can never do that. Somebody just starting to drive it's always going to be a complex, dynamic event, right? Not a complicated event, but a complex event. Because you can't predict what's going to happen around you at any one moment, right? Especially in a city. It may not be so complex if you're just on an empty country road. I don't know. But when I grew up, I learned to go up to New York City to drive. And driving in Houston, so it's pretty much always a complex dynamic event. Although I must say, driving, my kids have moved out to West Texas, my daughter and my grandkids. So when we go out there, which is 600 miles, most of which is just straight I-10, it starts to become a simple dynamic event, and it gets scary because you can get off, the road to die because your higher level stuff is gone, because of what we call highway hypnosis, and you just forget about the fact that you have to think at times. But anyway, that's a whole different issue. Okay. So now we have simple, and so simple right? And so simple being simple non-dynamic, if you will, simple dynamic, right? Simple non-dynamic is don't eat before you go to the dentist, right? Associations. Simple dynamic is a driver, an experienced driver is not having to use prefrontal cortex, not having to use the executive system to think and make decisions. Those decisions they feel like they're more automatic, those judgments and decisions, right? Or in a conversation, sometimes it gets simple. And then we have complicated, right? Which allows you to use reasoning, conditional thinking, sequential thinking, symbolic, analogical thinking, right? But it's subjective. Things say the same. Belong. You apply. If you can apply the right method or strategy, you get to where you need to go. And then we have complex. So complex decisions. Which, if you get accepted to 5 really good colleges, which one do you choose? And you can't do that quantitatively, and you can't do it analytically, right? But it's important. And so it becomes complex. And I just gave you another example of complex. Complicated can have a series of steps, a lot of steps. So I'll give you another example of complicated. You're trying to get from one end of a junkyard to another, big junkyard, full of all kinds of weird stuff. And you go in there, and at each point, something's blocking the way, or you encounter something that, you have to step over or around or whatever. And so you have a series of decisions you have to make based on the conditions. So you do that, and eventually you get to the other side. It's complicated. It's a series of steps. It's a series. You may not know how to do it. You can ask the guy, you can ask somebody else, and they'll tell you the series of steps. In other words, you don't have to know the series of conditions and steps, but you can learn them and then employ them, right? So even though it looks complex, see, the junk doesn't change what it is, right? The junk is there, right? And you can figure out your moves based on each condition that you achieve, right? There's no in-between, as opposed to trying to navigate through, as I said, a rushing river, which is very, very different. Things aren't. Anyway, so when we talk about adapting, let's go back to the word adapting. So what are we adapting for? You see? So when you move out of a formal educational environment, especially when you have compensations, you've been able to operate, if you're someone who's smart in a traditional sense, with complicated types of thinking, which is what we measure on IQ tests or achievement tests. You don't get complex problems, and certainly don't get complex dynamic problems or tests, and any of those. You can't do it on a standardized test by the nature of it being standardized. Right? Those situations, you're able to get a master's degree. You're able to do very well. The type of adaptation you learn is you can learn when to use one of your other moves that you have, or somebody can teach you to learn a new move. You can add. It's additive. It's cumulative, right? You can add a whole bunch of moves, a whole bunch of conditions. It can be very complicated in the sense of, and a lot of people start using the word complex. You have to be careful in the sense of a big flow chart. A big flow chart with lots of different steps and stages, which you can approach each step one by one, right? Eventually get to the bottom. Okay. Now you get into what we call the real world, and suddenly you start to realize that things are not that way. That all the great complicated ways of thinking that you learn and can do aren't working. What do you do? Well, you get depressed, you get anxious, you try to avoid, if you have autism, I'm saying. Now, if you don't have autism, it's not like it's a piece of cake. Complex dynamic things are not easy for anyone. And there's a percentage of people who don't have autism that don't make it either, right? They don't succeed for various different reasons. And we're not going to get into all those reasons. But for the vast majority of people who don't have autism, they're able to learn, they're able to adapt to increased complexity and increased dynamic, right? Elements, complex dynamic elements, to a certain point where they can have a certain quality of life, certain well-being. Not everybody, but most. So what stands out for people with autism is that they're unable to do that. Why? Also, is because from the very beginning of their development, they never moved into that pathway, which requires a guiding relationship. Right? They never learned to deal with greater complexity and greater issues of dynamic functioning, which, if you think about what we do in RDI, one of the things we do is we start with simple dynamic things. When we think about moving back and forth, and then adding small variations, right? What are you doing? And right, you shouldn't have to think about it after a while. It should become very much fun, pleasurable, right? Enjoyment where you each add a little variation, a little thing, right? And right, you're learning to function in a simple, dynamic manner, right? You're learning to perceive that you can do that. You can handle the ongoing continuity that's underneath the variation, right? And it should move into very much of an automatic, you don't have to stop every second, make judgments, decisions. It should be sort of built in. You learn that simple dynamic. That's one of the ways we start with RDI. And we desensitize people who have been afraid of that dynamic world, right? That's a way to desensitize, but also to train the brain, develop the brain, right, to be able to automatically do that. So now you're freed up to use the top level of the brain rather than reacting to dynamic things by, hiding, running away, avoiding, freezing, whatever. You engage. Right? We also start to learn to increase complexity, right? We add different ways of thinking, we add different perspectives, we try to say, well, try it from this way, we explore and experiment, right? Mentally adding new challenges little by little, increase complexity. And then we combine those complex dynamic things. We start to increase complexity, we increase the dynamic elements, we put them together, and we build a mind. That's how we build a mind and brain. That's how you're supposed to build a mind and brain. So by the time you get to adulthood, if you get to RDI, that's what you've been doing for all those years, right? It's not a big deal. That's how you've been functioning in the world. So it's just a continuation, right? In the real world, quote unquote, you've been in the real world. You've been in the more complex dynamic functioning. Not that everything's easy, but right, it's been going on for a long time. But again, if you have autism, you didn't even start, right? You didn't even start at the beginning. You don't even have the simple stuff worked out, let alone, right, the complex stuff. And what everyone's done in the world is taught you to be, first, very simple, like ABA type simple thinking, right? And then when they get more sophisticated, complicated thinking, scripts and social stories and, right, and interview techniques and strategies and even conceptual things, right? Academic things, right? Some very high level academic types of things, right? All complicated formulas. And you could build an atomic bomb in a complicated way. These days, not 1945, that was complex. They didn't know where they were going, what they were doing. But these days, it becomes more formulaic, very complicated, but formulaic, if you know your physics, whatever. You can do some amazing things, right? But you can't function on a day-to-day basis. You can't figure out if you've only got $50 and you've got $200 worth of debt right now, bills to pay, which ones, how much you pay for each one. It's not complicated. You can't just divide it up because some creditors aren't going to care if you give them, it's not sufficient. If you give them $10, they're still going to come after you. Others will be satisfied for a while, whatever. It gets much more complex in the world, even simple things like that. Okay? And so how do you adapt if you've never been adapting? See, learning is adapting. If you learn through what we're doing in dynamic intelligence, you're adapting through challenge from the very beginning, right? We're continually growing, increased complexity, increased dynamic capacity, integration, agility, step by step, piece by piece, year by year. So you get to the real world, it's just another thing. So I want to make that distinction. Is when you try to explain this to people, you see we're constantly adapting what we're trying to do. You have to understand, right? That adapting is not just adding another routine, or it's not just adding a more complicated thing to a script. The people with autism, the high functioning people, quote with high functioning people. People don't have a lot of other, intellectually impairing disorders or whatever, which are now about 75% of the diagnosed people. They can do that without therapies. And of course, it helps to have an expert teach them a new technique, like Stanley Kaplan. I mean, he helped me a lot doing the SAT, right? So it's not like they're not helpful, but they're no more helpful to them than they are to you or me. They don't change the nature of that person. They don't help you deal with the world. They help me deal with the SAT, right? I didn't learn anything else, right? It was additive. I learned, that's great next time I take an SAT. Actually, it helped me for the GREs, not specifically, but the idea that I could go to somebody and get help and learn strategies. So I did that, or a book. That time it was a book. But actually, I couldn't use the same methods on the GREs, the graduates, when I used the SATs. I would have screwed it up. I just learned sort of conceptually I should go and do something like that. I generalized, which is not as complicated stuff. But all the interventions, right, whether they're with children or adults, they have to do with giving you more additive things, complicated things, or teaching you to use what you've already got differently. They don't have anything to do with growth, complexity, or dynamic function. And that's why the data shows that each year that someone with high functioning autism is out of school, their chances to get good employment go down, not up. They go down. They don't adapt. They get less. They get more frustrated. And rather than learning from that experience, growing from those challenges and problems, they give up. They get demoralized because they say, well, there must be some kind of rules. There must be some kind of conditional thinking on mine. And there isn't. It's a whole different way of operating. It's really important for everyone to understand that and to be able to explain that to people. Because again, we use these words like everyone understands them, right? Complex, complicated, right? How many people understand that distinction? Figure out is nobody. Actually, systems theorists do. I learned that distinction reading systems theory, which I don't advise you to read. It's horrible. But, because they start throwing all these formulas in there in the middle of confusion. Anyway, they understand the difference. They talk about complicated systems and complex systems, and there really is a distinction, right? Everybody gets confused when they are talking about complex, dynamic versus complex. And again, I think it's because in our lives, some of it depends on how we perceive it. As I say, if you're in Vanuatu, it's dynamic. If you're in Houston, it's complex and may or may not be dynamic, depending on how much you invest yourself in the ongoing process of it. Right? Racial relations before George Floyd was killed for many people was complex. People out in the streets now, it's complex and dynamic each day. And dramatically, just like that. And it's just for perception. One event changed the perception of a bunch of people, became dynamic. Well, things haven't happened, but it was always complex. So complex things could stay complex, or they could become complex and dynamic. Other things can just start out complex and dynamic, and they just stay that way. But some of it is perception. There's some people who want to hold on to a simple view of the world, and they want to distort things so that nothing is complex. Whether everything can be worked out with a flow chart or an analysis and nothing. And you see high-functioning autistic people, unfortunately, getting supported by professionals who don't know any better, who tell them they're going to figure out and be successful in the world if they just learn enough complicated ways of operating. It's very sad. I mean, the professionals have no idea because they don't know the difference. Or they think that that's the best that the person can do, which it is because they've never started to operate, they've never developed their brain in a way that can manage complexity. Doesn't mean they can't learn it, but because your brain isn't developed for complexity, you won't be able to do it, right? You can't just become, you see, if you've been spending years developing your brain to operate with either simple, static, or complicated stuff, and I face something that's complex, I can't just change my brain today. You need to rehabilitate, you need to remediate, you need to gradually work towards, right, developing the neural functioning, right, the neural network relationships so that you can manage those things. That takes a while. That's not short. You can't do it in 9 weeks or 10 weeks. It takes years. Right? That's why we have a long-term remediation program, rehab program. It's not a short-term miracle. Obviously, if you're starting out with a 2-year-old, it's a lot easier, right? Because you don't have to undo. The brain hasn't developed. It's all of its network connections. You don't have to undo them, right? But, it still takes a long time. Anyway, I don't know if I've confused everyone or if I've helped you understand things, but I think it's really important to make these distinctions and to understand that the way we use these terms matters a great deal, right? And that we can't assume that people are going to understand what we're trying to do unless we explain that and how important it is to understand the distinctions there. Adaptation, complexity versus complicated, dynamic versus static. How critical it is to develop the mind and the brain to be able to function like that, and how it is possible for people with autism to do that if we give them the opportunity to learn that way, just like anyone else.
Thanks for joining us for ASD, A New Perspective, a podcast show where we help you understand the mind of your child. And we always encourage you that growth for your child is possible. I'm Kat Lee. See you next time.